A while back, I was testing to see if soloing faction outposts in blue and yellow zones could be good for faction points and making money and other things, which, spoiler alert, it's completely not, it's garbage, but while I was doing that, I happened to notice that there were a ton of faction flag players just hanging around doing activities in the open world in the blue and yellow zones around the towns. So I went and flagged up for Bridge Watch and went over to the Limhurst area around the blue and yellow zones around Limhurst and decided to gank some people to see how much faction points I could get and how good of an activity it was, and it was insane. But before we get into just how insane it was, I'm currently running a giveaway courtesy of SBI and their content creator program, so if you want some free stuff, head to the link in the description with my Discord server or in the comments and join there. So just before we get into how many faction points and things I made from this, just quickly to go over my build. So I was using a standard one-handed spear ganking build with a Fiend Cowl, Assassin Jacket, leather shoes, one-hand spear, mist collar, and Thetford Cape, with everything except for the Thetford Cape around tier 8. With high spec on every item, that's around 1300 to 1400 IP for each item. Now importantly with this, I was also using the Pest Lizard as a mount because it's a very broken ganking mount, especially for solo ganking. As you can see here, it allows you to get catches that you otherwise would never be able to get due to opponents being mounted and just running away from you. So with this build, I was able to kill up to around like 40 players per hour I got in one session. There is just so many people out in these zones that honestly, before I was done killing one person, I'd see another person, and I honestly had to wait for mana so many times because there's just so many people. Normally this build doesn't struggle with mana, but there's just a constant flow of people to kill with this. So I was actually sort of running out of mana and considering bringing mana potions along with me. For faction points, each person doesn't give a whole lot of faction points. It's usually between like 100 and 500 is sort of the average amount. I've gotten 1 from somebody, I've gotten over 700 from somebody, but usually it's between 100 and 500. And you really don't discriminate against who you kill because honestly, I have no idea how the amount of points are decided. I think it has something to do with how long that person's been alive or how long that person's stayed alive while faction flagged, because it doesn't seem to be based on their faction rank. As you can see here, I killed 2 guys with the same rank. One gives me 38 and the other one gives me 580, and it also doesn't seem to be based on the tier of gear that people are wearing, as I've killed people in 8-3 and got very low points and killed people in tier 4 and got very high points. This makes me think that it is based on the time they spent alive, because this also has a system to sort of protect itself against being abused by players who just kill their friends or kill their alts for free faction points. Quick side note, if you do know how this works, please feel free to drop a comment or contact me in the Discord and let me know so that I can add it to the video description or something, because I'm really curious to how these faction points are actually decided. Moving on to how many faction points I actually got, I was getting between around 30k to 40k faction points per hour, not including any of the daily or weekly bonus things. It seems like around half your points come from the points you actually get from killing players, but then also I was getting just like random drops of 10k plus faction points for like the quote-unquote faction defense. Even though I wasn't fighting within the faction zones, you seem to still get quite a lot of points for sort of helping defend your faction just by killing opponents right by their home zones. It's also important to note that I started right at the bottom of the faction ranking, so I was getting no bonus points for rank for quite a lot of it. Obviously, if you're high rank in your faction, you'll get more points than this per kill. Looking at how much money that makes us, so currently, at least for the Bridge Watch faction items, it's around 10 to 12 silver per faction point, depending on what you spend it on and what your rank is and what you can buy, which means our money per hour is between 300k and 500k per hour, not including the weekly bonus that you get, or any silver that you would get from the faction chests. For a perfectly safe yellow zone activity, this is actually not too bad. Obviously, it's not the best that you could do. However, if you include things like the weekly bonus faction points you're getting, the progress in your faction rank, I'd say it's actually a pretty good activity in terms of its rewards for being yellow zone. If you're worried about the repair costs from dying, really it's not too bad as long as you're not taking it like 8.3 masterpiece. My repair costs in tier 8 equivalent were like 20k silver, so it's really insignificant. Another thing to note is that I've sunk like hundreds of hours into solo open world PvP and ganking, so you might not be able to hit the 40 kill per hour mark, but there are tons of people out there, so even if you miss a gank, you'll have another opportunity to practice right away. And honestly, that is the best thing, my favorite thing about doing this activity, is that it is so good for practicing PvP and practicing solo open world PvP and ganking. Faction flagging deep into enemy territories is a really good simulation of what it's going to be like solo PvPing in the red zone and black zone, especially the red zone where there's lots of players. It's honestly just really amazing to practice how you're supposed to take fights and how you're supposed to gank people in a safe environment where you don't have to worry about losing too much money if you die. Honestly, even with the faction points that you get, it will cover for supply costs, so even if you want to practice using like invisibility potions, which are like 11k each, getting a kill will still pay for most of that invisibility potion, and so it really does make the perfect environment for practicing because you make enough money to cover for the costs of ganking. You can see I went out with this sort of like weird off-meta, pretty bad Death Givers build and just had fun fighting people in the open world and got some pretty great fights. If you want to do this for more content and practice than you do for money, which honestly is my suggestion because it's super good content, one thing that you can do that I did at the start, which I found pretty impactful, was to actually pick up a small transport mission. Because when people see you have a transport mission, they'll be more willing and likely to fight you out of their own accord rather than you having to go and try to dismount them or gank them. It costs around 90k to start one of these missions, so it's pretty cheap, and you will lose it if you die, but if you don't die, you can honestly just go and run the mission backwards and actually make some money. Honestly, this activity has been super fun for me, and the only real downside that I have to it is that if you die when you're deep into the enemy faction's territory, you don't just get respawned at the nearest faction outpost. Instead, you get respawned like one zone away and it will automatically deflag you. Basically, this just means that if you die, it does take quite a while to go and get reflagged and come back there, so if you're trying to learn PvP and you're dying pretty often, it will take sort of a long time to get back into the action if you happen to get knocked. One thing I'll quickly note here too is that the best zones are typically any of the ones directly adjacent to the town except for the tier 3 zone behind it. So in Limhurst it would be these 3 zones, the 2 blue zones and the yellow zone right beside it, as those just have the most amount of people faction flagged in them. Blue zones will give you slightly less faction points for every knockdown that you get, however it's really insignificant, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. If you're finding that there's too many people in these zones and you want a little bit of a break between fights or practice finding people in a less populated map, you can go to the zones just one away from those zones, especially in the yellow zones, and there will still be a fair amount of faction flag players out there for you to find and kill. Another thing to note is that there's currently a bug in the game where if somebody is in a dungeon, either group dungeon or solo dungeon, and you knock them in there while faction flagged, you will not get any points from those players. So just know that if you follow someone into the dungeon, you're not going to get any points if you knock them, but other than that, it works just the same. Anyways, that's all I have for you in this video, guys. If you want to learn PvP, I would 100% suggest doing this. It is very fun. Or if you just want some good solo open world content, again, very good. I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next video.